To say that fandom goes gaga over bland, boring white men is like saying that Hypnodisc was a bit destructive. Historically, white male characters do not have to have much effort put into their character to get a huge fan base and think pieces about how deep and complex their character is. When I think about this, my thoughts usually go to Bucky Barnes, who became extremely popular and got an army of fangirls within his first appearance, and think pieces and video essays about how deep his character was, in spite of the fact that it wasn't until The Falcon and the Winter Soldier that he actually had anything close to a character arc or even a personality 10 years after his debut. Before then, he was Steve's friend, who then died and came back as a mind-controlled super soldier and then mumbled about in the background for the next few films. But the fandom just made shit up, filled in the chasm on their own. Granted, it was an impressive amount of work creating an entire fanon from scratch with no information to work with, but it was fanon. A second but much less egregious example that comes to mind when I think about this is Hunter Whittabane, for whom his importance to the story and even his personality is entirely a fabrication of the fandom. Even his rebelling against an abuser in canon is undercut by the fact it's basically a preordained destiny because every Golden Guard has betrayed Bellows. The fandom went whole hog onto Hunter to the point of creating entire AUs where Hunter is the real main character of the story and gets adopted by Ida. No, really, that's a thing they do with alarming but unsurprising frequency. Furthermore, Hunter ended up being the vector for a lot of people to start caring about Willow, Darius, and Camilla, insofar as they can be used to bolster Hunter's character with romance and adoption, respectively. Before this point, these characters were ignored or in some cases vilified. Taking a trip over to Pokemon, in Sword and Shield, Bede was considered by many to be one of the best rivals ever created, while Hop is routinely derided for being annoying. However, both their characters are complete nothing burgers. One of them just happens to be a pasty kid with white hair, and the other isn't. Furthermore, plenty of rivals in Pokemon have a nasty habit of coming off like creepy stalkers toward the player. In fact, N is so creepy toward the player, he qualifies for some kind of sex offender registration. However, the only time the fanbase took any notice of it was when a woman was doing it. An Hispanic woman, no less. Speaking of Bede, he shows up again in Baldur's Gate 3 as a bog-standard snotty British guy vampire love interest that probably takes the award for most generic D&D character ever made. All he's missing is high charisma and a tendency to bang anything that moves to officially be called a clone trooper. He's also the character the fanbase goes the most gaga over. Not gonna lie, if you asked me to rank Baldur's Gate characters by romantic tension with the main character, I would put Astarion below Imoen. Conversely, Will also looks pretty generic, dreadlocks and a blind eye. Pfft, calm thy trousers, Don Juan. But when you actually meet him, his defining moment is teaching tiefling babies how to fight. Aww. And he has genuinely far more charisma in his pinky finger than Andy Dick here has in his entire body. This is just a better character overall. Like, what do y'all see in Captain Bland over here? Do Red Eyes and Darling really do it for you? But the one that always sticks out to me is Arthas Menethil, who I've done an entire video on in the past, and who sticks out precisely because the writers have done everything in their power to make you hate this guy. In canon, Arthas is a character doomed by his own hubris, a man who is given every opportunity to do good and actively chooses evil every single time. Arthas is an interesting villain insofar as he is utterly detestable, and every moment you spend with him makes you want to stove his head in with a pipe even more. And it's interesting how the story itself doesn't dissuade you from this perspective. Never at any point are you expected to empathize with Arthas beyond the realm of you wouldn't be ending your life at the hands of an angry blood elf if you had made different decisions, you worthless piss hound. And Wrath of the Lich King furthers this by highlighting that Arthas really is just a pathetic little bitch sitting up on his ivory tower and seething like an asshole. By the time of ICC, not only are some of the bosses just new versions of slaves you've already killed or who are on your side, but when you actually kill him, you find out he's been keeping fucking effigies of them like an absolute lunatic. Arthas is kind of like WoW's version of Tyler Durden. The moment you sit back and think about him at all, he's just absolutely insane. People will argue that he was corrupted by the Lich King, but the reason the Lich King targeted him in the first place is because he was already a psychopath just waiting for an excuse. But to hear some WoW players talk, mostly Alliance mains, you could be forgiven for thinking Arthas' story is a tragic fall of a good and noble person being pushed to his absolute peak and maximum in an unwinnable situation, being cruelly abandoned by those who claim to love him and being manipulated by dark forces beyond his comprehension to walk into a trap that would destroy not only himself but his people and change the fabric of Azeroth forever. And the problem with that approach is that's Sylvanas Windrunner you're thinking of. But asking Alliance and Orc players to view a blonde male human paladin who is literally every fascist dream come true as a villain and sympathize with any woman at any time is asking the impossible. Arthas is viewed as a more complex character than he actually is because in the eyes of fandom, as a white man, he has to be. Any notion that he is not complicated and not sympathetic is treated like a mistake, that the authorial intent was for him to be a different character entirely and they just failed to realize it despite that character already existing. I bring up Arthas in particular because it's one of the few instances where the fandom delusion about a white male character just flat out wasn't ever validated. Arthas starts his story being told to fuck off and go to hell by one of his more noteworthy victims and ends that story 20 years later being told to fuck off and go to hell by the other one. And boy howdy did the audience throw a fucking fit. This was arguably the most character compliant the post-Metzen writers had ever been, keeping Arthas in line with his actual characterization, and Alliance players lost their shit. Go back up 2 paragraphs and we have my main point for this video. In the eyes of fandom, a white male character has to be complicated, sympathetic, or both, and instances where a white male character is not those things is treated like a mistake, which is why fandom will latch onto them with headcanons up the ass. Conversely, women and characters of color will not be afforded the same level of empathy. If they happen to be flatly written, that character will be hated almost instantly. While Arthas is the most high profile, there was a quieter one that happened under a lot of people's noses in Harry Potter's fandom. See, Potterheads have this thing where they desperately want Slytherin to be more complicated as a house because they still think the houses are some kind of personality litmus test and not just high school cliques with a logo. But most of Slytherin characters were already pretty hard characterized neutral evil bigots. But for the first 5 books, there was one named Slytherin character for whom we only had a name and a house and literally nothing else. Blaze. So Blaze was the target of tens of thousands of headcanons and fanfics about them being the secret noble Slytherin by a fanbase of screaming girls. They were arguably more popular among the Slytherin characters than Malfoy just because of their malleability. Right up until the Half-Blood Prince came out and Blaze was explicitly established to be black, whereupon his popularity vanished overnight. The backlash to this single line of narration was so pronounced it technically qualifies as fucking lore. People tried to argue they were just so torn up about losing a headcanon that was just so important to them, but nobody with 2 brain cells to rub together was buying that line of absolute horse shit. When I first started criticizing Hunter, it came around the time I became a lot more vocally invested in non-white characters, and some people, in a prime example of desperately trying to give me what they think is a taste of my own medicine, came up to me and said with their whole pussy, if Hunter was black, you'd like him. And I always countered that with a very simple truth. If Hunter was black, you wouldn't. If Hunter was black, the fandom would not have ignored every single skeezy thing he does, like his supposedly best episode, according to fangirls, that established Huntlow as a ship, where he uses the power of the state to kidnap several children and force them to join the Magic Gestapo. They would not view this action equally if Hunter was dark-skinned, and stop writing that well actually comment, you will not convince me that they would. Furthermore, the main issue with Hunter is that the story spends a lot of time with him, but spends no time developing him outside of making goofy faces for the internet. Making him black wouldn't fix these problems, it would exacerbate them, because now you have a black character you are doing nothing with, yet proudly displaying that you are doing nothing with him. And that's a problem because it's now the 3rd time you've done that. But all this distracts from the real problem. Hunter is only allowed to get away with being a complete nothing burger of a character despite taking up so much screen time because he's white and male. This is the only element of his character that people like, and everything else is fanon that they made up. What little there is to his character is just ideas that were stolen from Luce and Amity, and yet Hunter eclipsed them both in popularity. Ironically, the Owl House goes to even further lengths to make Hunter a useless non-character, because all of his acts of rebellion end up being underwritten by the fact that every Golden Guard is turned on Belos in the same way. So Hunter isn't even operating on his own accord, it's just gut instinct. Meanwhile, if you like a character who isn't a white guy just because you vibe with them, you're expected to answer for it. Hunter stands can freely fawn over a character just because he's pasty and blonde as long as they invent pages upon pages of cope. But if I like a character just because their VA is cool and I vibe with their energy, I'm expected to justify that like I'm in fucking court. I quite like Skara because her design is cool, Kimberly Brooks is one of my favorite VAs, and I like this little quasi-recovery arc she's got going on in the background. And butthurt Hunter stands, angry about my criticism of the character, always throw that back in my face because those shallow surface level traits of the character are the things I call them out for focusing on. This ignores the fact that Skara is a tertiary character and is therefore allowed to be mostly surface level. Hunter is a main character with the exact same level of depth as a background character. You can argue this is because the show was cancelled, but when you spend 8 episodes doing nothing to progress a character, the problem isn't that you didn't have enough time. It's part of the status quo where female characters and non-white characters get nitpicked to high fucking hell, and then those same people doing that turn around and act like you're the weird one for not caring about their nitpicks. People will viciously criticize women or non-white characters for things that, if the character was white and male, would have made them the new Blorbo baby boy. And other people pointing this out, or even worse, flipping the script and putting white characters under proportionate scrutiny, is seen as some kind of cardinal sin. Kylo Ren can genocide an entire star system and actively refuse redemption 3 fucking times, and white girls will demand the Ben-demption, but Reva cuts one woman's hand off, putting her on the same ethical level as Obi-Wan fucking Kenobi, and people act like she's a psychopathic monster, and it doesn't take much to see the double standard. You're not clever or subtle, and people see what you're doing. There's a similar iteration of this in the way fandom will often pit black women unfavorably against white women for the same sins, or in some cases, less unreasonable iterations of that sin. There's a notorious example in invincible when Amber, on and off girlfriend to the titular character, is pissed when she finds out that Mark has been lying to her about being a superhero. Fandom is quick to demonize Amber for being angry, despite the fact that Amber showed Mark way more patience than she should have, ultimately breaking things off after being ghosted one too many times. Now, if this behavior sounds familiar to you, that's because it's been the standard operating procedure for one particular DC Comics character for about 85 years. You might recognize her name is Lois Lane.
Lois, what are you doing?
You wouldn't let me die, Superman.
Lois, you're all right. I thought that...
And don't pretend that hurt, Superman.
We'll do this the hard way.
This lady is crazy.
When it comes to emotional blackmail as a spectator sport, Lois Lane has been allowed to get away with everything from suicide baiting to threatening people with a gun. If anything, being Queen of the People's Republic of Overreactistan is just a character trait of hers at this point.
You are the lowest form of life imaginable.
And the only time Lois's actions have ever been questioned by people at large is the one time she's depicted as not being a white woman. And even then people jump to, well, it's Lois Lane, she's always been like this, while in the same breath continuing to demonize a black woman for being far more reasonable with her grievances. Gonna be honest, I got tired of Lois's shit after the 10 millionth time they pulled this same story. Fandom puts in a ton of effort to prop up white male characters and even just white characters in general, even if that character had no effort put into them by the creators. Fandom does not put in this much effort for characters who are women or people of color. In most cases, they will often act as if the character was shallower than they actually were, often villainizing them, especially if they were mean to their white blorbos. Female characters and characters of color have to have entirely detailed, nuanced backstories in order for there to be a slim chance, a fucking chance, that fandom will acknowledge it. White male characters just have to stand there and try not to drool, and fandom will fawn over them for years. And this is a problem mostly because being a racist is a shit awful thing to be, but also because it just leads to stories getting worse. As much as some people want to ignore this, the industry does pay attention to useless Twitter garbage. They shouldn't, but they do. The multi-camera sitcom, a genre that has been around for decades, briefly died in the 2010s, solely because an army of dumb shit nerds got way too furious at Chuck Lorre for making fun of them, and spent the next decade sincerely arguing that the elements of the multi-camera sitcom that practically defined the genre were passé and the death of modern culture. This was a genre that had managed to produce some of the most poignant topical material that television had to offer, and in some cases, use the fact that it was largely silly fun to really emphasize the moments where things got dramatic. There are actors out there whose best performances were in these shows, and then in the span of 10 years, it almost completely vanished off the face of the earth for sterile dramedies, entirely because an army of nerds decided to target the laugh track in order to grind an axe against a Jewish man who made fun of them. Yeah, that wasn't just a tangent. And the knock-on effect of nothing burger white characters being uplifted while other much more well-written characters get written off completely is not something you should ignore. And if the industry can be convinced to throw away its most popular moneymaker genre that everyone fucking adored and produced more classics than every other genre combined just because Twitter users were on a fascist bender, I do not want to think about the kind of effect that fandom can have on characters that are already struggling to get attention paid to them. I've spoken about this issue in bits and pieces in the past, but never really did an entire video on the matter, largely because anytime I do talk about this issue, the freaks of nature who stalk me will jump out of the woodwork and scream accusations of xenophobia for, ironically, talking about xenophobia. I mean, I got accused of fetishizing black women for writing the same soft, goofy romance that I always write, but with a black girl this time. And it used to work because that was a narrative I didn't want people following, but honestly I just don't give a shit anymore. The fact is, fandom will consistently fall over itself in a desperate bid to uplift whatever random white guy they can, and daring to commit the mortal sin of acknowledging that will get you swarmed in harassment. I mean, the shit these creatures have put me through is ghoulish, but it's practically fucking kind compared to the shit they've put Stitch through. Stitch's body of work is where I got most of this thesis. They spent years talking about all of this shit. You think I was paying attention to Blaze Zabini discourse when I was 13? Of course not. Stitch had a fucking article about it. Stitch has been covering this fucking garbage for longer than some of you have been alive, and has been subjected to fucking Anthony Legato levels of obsessive lunatic stalking that just follows them everywhere they fucking go, running them off multiple websites, forcing them to go private, and telling the kind of lies that would make the lies about me seem like a fucking compliment. And if any of the shit I've summarized today wasn't entirely racism, you would not be doing this. You would not be so desperately trying to terrorize someone off the internet this fucking badly if what they were saying wasn't completely 100% true and you just felt attacked. Stitch hits the nail on the head every single fucking time, and y'all have been coping and seething about it for years because your actions are so transparent you have no other recourse than violence. Those kind of tactics are not used by the innocent. If Stitch was wrong, they wouldn't need 20,000 people trying to destroy their life, trying to prove them wrong. one would have been enough. Well, time to make more aggressive filtering rules for the comment section. Go support Stitch. Financially. Their links are in the description instead of mine.